He didn't even let her speak. Thaddeus Vance snatched the photograph from his own breast pocket, held it up next to Abigail's face in front of every soul standing on that platform, and laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an embarrassed one, a loud, deliberate laugh that silenced the whole station like a gunshot. This? He waved the photograph like it was a losing hand of cards. This is what showed up? Abigail stood completely still. 43 cents in her coat pocket, dust from 3 days of travel still on her boots, and every single person on that platform staring at her like she was something that had crawled out of a damaged freight crate. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody helped. If this story already has your heart pounding, you are exactly who this channel was made for. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss a single story. And before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Coldwater Creek, because what happens next will stay with you for a long time. The train had been 3 days and 2 nights of hard travel, and Abigail Brennan had spent most of it sitting upright in a second-class car that smelled like coal smoke and other people's worry. She didn't have money for a sleeping berth. She barely had money for the ticket itself, and the 43 cents left in her coat pocket represented the sum total of her financial situation in the world. She had counted it twice on the first night, then put it away and decided not to count it again. There were things you could afford to think about and things you couldn't, and the math of 43 cents was firmly in the second category. What she had instead of money was a bundle of letters tied with a piece of kitchen string sitting at the bottom of her traveling bag beneath a change of clothes, and a small photograph of herself taken 2 summers ago at a church social. The letters were from a man named Thaddeus Vance of Coldwater Creek, Montana Territory, who had responded to her advertisement in the Matrimonial Gazette with what she had taken to be genuine warmth and careful respect. He had written about his land, about the creek that ran through the back of his property, about wanting a capable woman who understood that frontier life was hard work and not a romantic story. She had appreciated that honesty. She had written back and told him the same things about herself, that she was not delicate, that she had been keeping her family's household since she was 13 years old, that she knew how to stretch a dollar until it screamed, that she was not looking for a fairy tale. They had exchanged 7 letters over 4 months. On the strength of those 7 letters and a train ticket he had sent in the 8th envelope, she had packed her bag, said goodbye to a life in Ohio that had very little left to offer her, and come west. She arrived at the Coldwater Creek station at 2:30 in the afternoon, stepping down onto the platform with her bag in one hand and her composure in the other, wearing the best dress she owned, which was dark blue wool that had been mended at the left cuff and was starting to show wear at the collar. She looked around the platform. Several men stood waiting. She recognized none of their faces. Then a man toward the back of the crowd reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a small photograph and looked at it. Then he looked at her. Then he looked at the photograph again. She knew immediately that it was him. She started walking toward him, and she watched his face while she walked, and something in her stomach understood what was happening before her mind was willing to name it. Thaddeus Vance was a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with a neatly trimmed beard and boots that had been recently polished. He looked exactly like a man who had expectations. And as she covered the distance between them, she watched those expectations collapse. She was still 8 feet away when he held the photograph up beside her face. "This?" he said, loud enough for the whole platform to hear. "This is what showed up?" He laughed. She had already described it, that laugh. But standing in the middle of it was a different experience than describing it later would ever convey. It was not nervous or confused. It was the laugh of a man who had made a decision and was performing it publicly so that everyone around him would understand his position, so there would be no ambiguity about who was rejecting whom. Abigail stopped walking. She did not reach out to shake his hand. She did not say his name. She stood there with her traveling bag at her side and let the moment exist, because she understood instinctively that any reaction she gave him right now would be used as additional material. "I wrote to you honestly," she said. Her voice was even. She was slightly surprised by that. "You sent a photograph from 10 years ago and a description that was—" He made a gesture with his hand that finished the sentence without words, and 2 men near the baggage counter snorted. The photograph is 2 years old, she said. Doesn't matter. He tucked it back into his pocket like he was filing away a piece of evidence. I've got standards, and this arrangement isn't going to work. You can take the next train back to wherever you came from. He paused. You're welcome to keep the ticket money since you made the trip. He said that last part like he was being generous. Then he turned around and walked away. Abigail stood on the platform and watched him go. She noticed the width of his shoulders and the confidence in his stride and the way no one on that platform said a single word in her direction. Not a word of sympathy, not an offer of help, not even the ordinary human acknowledgement that something unkind had just happened in front of witnesses. They looked away, every one of them. She stood there for a long moment. Then she picked up her bag, straightened the collar of her blue wool dress, and began to think. She had 43 cents. She had a return ticket, technically, but she'd priced it out and the fare back to Ohio was more than what remained from the money she'd spent getting here. She did not have family to wire for help. She did not have friends wealthy enough to rescue her by telegram. She had the clothes in her bag, a handful of practical skills, and approximately 2 hours before the station master would start wondering why she was still standing on his platform. She went inside and sat down on the bench nearest the window and took a breath. A woman sitting 2 benches over watched her with the specific expression of someone who had seen this happen before and developed a policy of not getting involved. Abigail did not hold it against her. She understood the calculation. The station master, a thin man in his 50s named Eustace, eventually came over with the energy of someone doing a task they didn't particularly want to do. Train back east doesn't run until Thursday, he said. You need somewhere to stay until then? I need work, Abigail said. He looked at her the way people looked at a problem they weren't personally responsible for. Boarding house is full up. Mrs. Halloran's got a room, but she doesn't... I'm not looking for a room, Abigail said. I'm looking for work. Is there anyone in this town who needs help? Household work, cooking, mending, anything. Eustace scratched the back of his neck. Mercer might, he said, more to the window than to her. Cole Mercer, ranch up in the North Hills. He lost his wife 14 months ago, 4 kids and not enough hands. He paused. Rough situation. Where do I find him? Sheriff's office sometimes, around this hour. He comes in for mail on Tuesdays. Thank you, Abigail said, and she meant it. She walked to the sheriff's office. The sheriff himself was a heavy-set man named Briggs, who looked up from his desk with the expression of a man encountering a complication he hadn't scheduled. He listened to her for approximately 90 seconds, then leaned back in his chair and called through the back door. Cole, come out here a minute. The man who came through the door was not what she expected, though she wasn't entirely sure what she had expected. He was somewhere in his late 30s, lean in the way that came from physical work rather than intention, with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that were visibly rough even from across the room. He had the face of someone who slept badly and had made peace with that. He looked at her the way you looked at something when you were too tired to form a quick opinion. This is Miss Brennan, Briggs said. She's looking for work. Household help. Vance apparently... He paused. Well, she needs work. Cole Mercer looked at her steadily. What kind of work? Whatever needs doing, Abigail said. Cooking, cleaning, mending, managing a household. I'm capable. I've got 4 children, Cole said, and I can't pay wages right now. The season was hard. I know, she said, though she didn't exactly. But she recognized the shape of financial hardship in the way he said it, matter of fact, without apology or shame, just information. Give me a roof, she said, and I will work for my meal. Cole looked at her for a long moment. He glanced at Briggs. Briggs looked at the ceiling. 1 meal, Cole said. 1 is enough. He was quiet for another moment. Then, my wagon's out front. I'm leaving in 20 minutes. She nodded. I'll be there. She was there in 12. The ride to the Mercer Ranch took the better part of 2 hours, and most of it passed in silence. Cole drove without looking at her much, which she found she didn't mind. She spent the time watching the landscape change as they moved north and upward, the flat outskirts of town giving way to rougher terrain, rockier ground, hills that pressed up against each other with the haphazard confidence of things that had never needed to justify their presence. She was thinking about what she'd seen in that sheriff's office, the exhaustion in Cole Mercer's face that went deeper than a single bad night, The slight shabbiness of his coat that said it had been a while since anyone had taken note of wear and thought to do something about it. The way Sheriff Briggs had looked at the ceiling when Cole's name came up. The look of a man who felt sympathy he didn't know how to express. "How old are your children?" she asked, when they had been on the road for perhaps 40 minutes. Cole kept his eyes on the horses. "Silas is 16, Joe is 15, Toby is 10, Maggie is 5. "Joe is a girl?" "Josephine. She goes by Joe." A brief pause. "She's been running the house since Eleanor died." Abigail filed that information away carefully. "For 14 months. About that." She nodded and looked back at the road. They arrived at the ranch as the light was going golden and sideways across the land, which made everything look a little better than it actually was, and even so she could see the work that needed doing. The front step had a board that had shifted. 2 of the fence rails near the gate were loose. The kitchen garden was overgrown in the way gardens got, when the person responsible for them had been pulled in 17 other directions at once. The children appeared in sequence, as if summoned by the sound of the wagon. Silas came out of the barn, assessed her with 16-year-old deliberateness, and went back inside. Toby appeared on the porch and stared openly with the uncomplicated curiosity of a 10-year-old who hadn't yet developed the social instinct to pretend he wasn't staring. Little Maggie pressed herself against the doorframe and watched with her thumb near her mouth, not quite in it, almost 5 years old and already negotiating between comfort and dignity. And then Joe. Joe came around the side of the house with wood chips on her sleeves and her dark hair pulled back with a piece of cord that wasn't quite doing its job. She was 15 years old and she moved like someone who was 30, carrying the specific posture of a person who had learned to be in charge of things before they were ready. She stopped when she saw Abigail. Her eyes went to the dress first, the blue wool, the mended cuff, and then to Abigail's face, and then to her father's. "Pa," she said. Not a question, not a greeting, just his name, carrying a cargo of meaning he clearly understood. "She's going to help out," Cole said simply. Joe looked at Abigail again. Something moved behind her eyes that wasn't quite hostility, but was getting ready to be. "We're fine," she said. "I know you are," Abigail said. That seemed to catch Joe off guard. She'd clearly expected either an argument or an apology. Abigail didn't offer either. She just picked up her bag and looked at Cole. "Where would you like me to put my things?" Cole pointed her toward a small room off the back of the kitchen, barely more than a pantry with a cot installed in it, a single hook on the wall, a window about the size of a piece of notebook paper. She looked at it, set her bag on the cot, and went to find the kitchen because that was the first thing she needed to understand. The kitchen told her everything. It was not dirty, exactly. Joe had clearly been holding things together with genuine effort, but there was the particular chaos of a space that was being managed by someone who was stretched too thin. Things put away in the wrong places, staples running low in ways that hadn't been noticed yet, a pot with a loose handle that someone had worked around so many times it had become invisible. The bread bin was nearly empty. There were onions going soft in the corner. She put the soft onions in her coat pocket and did not mention them to anyone. She made dinner that first night from what was available: a simple bean and salt pork stew, cornbread, the last of a jar of preserved pears for the children. It wasn't much, but it was hot, and it was ready on time, and she made enough of it. She ate standing at the counter after everyone else had sat. Joe watched her do this and didn't say anything. After dinner, when the children had gone to bed and Cole was sitting at the table with a ledger he kept opening and closing without writing in it, Abigail washed the dishes and looked out the kitchen window at the dark hills and thought about the fact that she had 43 cents and a cot in a pantry and a morning's worth of work already planned in her head. She had expected to feel worse about this situation than she did. She didn't know yet that the worst part wasn't behind her. She didn't know that the winter coming down from the north was going to be the hardest anyone in the Coldwater Creek Valley had seen in 20 years, or that the family she had come to help was closer to falling apart than even Cole Mercer understood. She didn't know about the food she was going to have to hide, or the portions she was going to have to quietly shrink, or the night 3 months from now when Joe would look at her across a half-empty kitchen and finally say the thing she'd been keeping locked up since her mother died. She didn't know any of that yet. She just washed the dishes, dried them, put them away in the places they actually belonged, and went to bed. Outside, somewhere in the dark hills, The first cold wind of the season moved through the pine trees with a sound like something trying to get in. Nobody in the Mercer house slept particularly well that night, but Abigail Brennan had stopped expecting things to be easy somewhere around mile 200 on the train, and she had made her peace with that long before the wagon pulled into this yard. And when she lay down on the cot in the pantry with her coat over her shoulders because the blanket was thin, she closed her eyes and she did not feel sorry for herself. She thought about the onions she'd saved from the corner. Tomorrow she would find out what else in this house was about to be lost if nobody paid attention. She was good at paying attention. That, at least, was something she had always had. The morning after Abigail arrived, Jo was already at the stove before sunrise. She hadn't slept much. She'd lain in her bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person in the house. The small shift of weight on the pantry cot. The soft sound of someone breathing in a room that had been empty for 14 months. And she'd stared at the ceiling with her arms crossed over her chest like she was holding something in place. She told herself she wasn't angry. She was just being careful. When she came into the kitchen at 5:15, she found the cornmeal already measured out on the counter, the fire already going in the stove, and Abigail standing at the window with a cup of water, watching the dark outside turn the particular shade of gray that came just before color returned to the world. Jo stopped in the doorway. Abigail turned around. She didn't look surprised to see her. She didn't say good morning with the bright, effortful cheerfulness of someone trying to make a good impression. She just said, "The cornmeal's measured. I wasn't sure how you take it." Jo looked at the measured cornmeal. She looked at Abigail. "We add a little salt and some of the lard from the crock by the window." "All right," Abigail said and stepped back from the stove. Just like that. Stepped back and let Jo do it her way, without a word about how she might do it differently. Jo noticed. She filed it away in the part of her mind that was still collecting evidence, still building the case for what this woman actually was and what she actually wanted. She stirred the cornmeal and didn't say anything else, and Abigail sat down at the far end of the table with her water and looked at the wall. And the kitchen was quiet in a way that wasn't entirely uncomfortable. That bothered Jo more than the alternative would have. Toby came down first, as he always did, drawn by the smell of the stove like a 10-year-old homing device. He stopped when he saw Abigail sitting at the table, then looked at Jo with a question on his face that he didn't know how to make into words. Jo gave him the look that meant sit down and be normal. And he sat down and was approximately normal, which for Toby meant staring at Abigail between bites with the shameless focus of someone who hadn't yet learned that staring was a social offense. "What happened to your dress?" he asked, after about 4 minutes of this. Abigail looked down at the blue wool. "What do you mean?" "It's got a patch on the sleeve, right there." "Toby," Jo said, "I'm just asking." "It's a mend," Abigail said without any embarrassment. "The seam came apart and I fixed it. It's the same as your boot there. The right one, the sole's coming away from the toe. That can be fixed too, if you've got a needle and some waxed thread." Toby looked down at his boot. He looked up at Abigail. "How'd you see that?" "I notice things," she said simply. Silas came in from the barn at 6, the way he always did, expecting the kitchen to be exactly as he'd left it the night before. He was 16 and he had the particular brand of 16-year-old male grief that expressed itself primarily as cold distance. The kind that made him look like he didn't care about anything when, in fact, he cared so much it was practically leaking out of him. He poured himself coffee, sat down, and treated Abigail's presence at the table the same way he treated most things that made him uncomfortable, which was to look directly through her. Abigail let him. She didn't try to talk to him. She didn't try to be warm. She ate her cornmeal. The smallest portion at the table, Jo noticed, though she didn't remark on it. And she drank her water, and she seemed perfectly comfortable being ignored by a 16-year-old who was working very hard at ignoring her. After breakfast, she asked Jo where the mending basket was. Jo pointed to the back room. Then, because she was 15 and couldn't entirely help herself, she said, "There's a lot of it." "I expected that," Abigail said. "Mama used to do it on Sunday evenings," Jo said, and then immediately wished she hadn't, because she hadn't meant to say that, hadn't meant to offer anything personal, and now it was just sitting there in the air between them. Abigail didn't react with sympathy or rush to fill the silence with something comforting. She just nodded once, like the information had been received and stored respectfully, and went to find the mending basket. Joe stood in the kitchen for a moment after she left and felt the particular irritation of someone who is trying to dislike a person and not finding it as easy as they'd expected. She went out to the barn to check on the horses. The second day was harder than the first in some ways. Cole came in for lunch looking like he'd been fighting with the fence line in the east pasture, which he had been, and he sat down at the table and ate what Abigail had made. A decent soup from the ham bone she'd found at the back of the cold store that Joe had completely forgotten about. And he said, "This is good," in the flat, factual way of a man who had stopped expecting things to be good and was mildly surprised when they were. Abigail said, "Thank you," and refilled Toby's bowl without being asked. Cole went back out. Abigail washed the pot. Joe dried it and put it away in the wrong place out of habit, and then stopped and looked at the cabinet and moved it to the right place, because she'd watched Abigail spend 15 minutes quietly reorganizing the kitchen that morning, and had noticed, though she hadn't said anything, that there was a logic to where things were now that there hadn't been before. She didn't mention that she'd moved the pot. Abigail didn't mention it either. On the third morning, Maggie wandered into the kitchen in her nightgown at 5:30 and stood in the doorway looking at Abigail with the serious, unguarded assessment of a 5-year-old who hadn't yet developed the ability to pretend. Abigail looked back at her without rushing to smile or kneel down or do any of the things adults did when they were performing friendliness at children. "You're still here," Maggie said. "I am," Abigail said. "Are you going to be here tomorrow?" "I expect so." Maggie considered this. "Joe said you might leave." Abigail looked at the stove. "I don't have anywhere to leave to," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, not sad exactly, but honest in the specific way that children recognized, because it was the same way they themselves talked, before they learned to dress things up, that made Maggie pad across the kitchen floor in her bare feet and climb up onto the chair closest to the stove. "Your feet will get cold," Abigail said. "I know," Maggie said, unconcerned. Abigail looked at the bare feet. Then she went to the back room and came back with a pair of Toby's old socks that she'd found in the mending basket, darned but clean. She set them on the table in front of Maggie without ceremony. Maggie looked at them, then at Abigail, then pulled them on. They were too big. Her feet swam in them. She didn't seem to mind. Joe came in 20 minutes later and found her sister sitting at the table in Toby's old socks, telling Abigail about a cat that had lived in their barn 2 summers ago and what its name had been and why. Abigail was listening with the complete attention of someone who found this genuinely interesting, not the performance of attention adults put on for children when they were actually thinking about something else. Joe stood in the doorway longer than she needed to. Then she came in and started the stove and didn't say anything. The thing about the first 2 weeks was that nothing dramatic happened. There was no confrontation, no breaking point, no moment where everything crystallized. What there was instead was a slow accumulation of small things that Joe kept not being able to ignore. The way Abigail fixed Toby's boot sole on the 4th day, sitting at the kitchen table with the waxed thread and a thick needle, working steadily until it was done right, handing the boot back without fanfare. The way she found the loose board on the front step, the one that had been shifting for 3 months, and didn't wait for Cole to fix it, but asked Silas where the hammer was and did it herself, quietly, one afternoon while Silas was watching from the barn door, with the specific expression of someone whose hostility was starting to cost him more energy than it was worth. The way she started keeping a list, not a visible list, nothing written down, but Joe began to notice that Abigail was tracking things. The food stores, the wear on certain items, the small shortfalls that had accumulated like sediment at the bottom of a river. She would open the flour bin and there would be something in her eyes that wasn't worry exactly, but was cousin to it. A calculation. She was adding things up that no one else had looked at in a while. On the 14th day, she asked Cole a question at dinner. "How long until you can get into town again?" Cole looked up from his plate. "Why?" "The salt is low. The flour won't last past the end of the month. We're almost out of oil for the lamp in the front room." Cole was quiet for a moment. "I was planning to go in next week." "Next week should work," Abigail said, and went back to eating. Silas looked at her from across the table. It was the first time he'd actually looked at her, directly, with any expression other than deliberate blankness. The expression on his face now was harder to name, something between surprise and reluctant respect, with a thin layer of suspicion still on top. He looked back down at his food and didn't say anything. But he looked. Jo noticed that too. She noticed everything, the same way Abigail noticed everything, and she recognized this fact about herself with a feeling that was uncomfortably close to kinship. The fight, when it finally happened, came on a Wednesday evening in the third week. It wasn't a fight exactly. It was quieter than that, and worse. Jo came in from feeding the animals to find Abigail reorganizing the pantry, not chaotically, carefully, methodically, moving things from where they'd been to positions that made clear logical sense if you thought about what got used most often and what needed to be visible and what could be stored further back. The pantry had been exactly the way Eleanor Mercer had arranged it. For 14 months, Jo had maintained it exactly that way, not because the arrangement was efficient, but because it was her mother's. "Stop," Jo said. Abigail stopped. She turned around. She held a jar of preserved beans in each hand and looked at Jo steadily. "That's not your pantry," Jo said. Her voice came out lower than she intended, which was worse than if it had come out loud. Low meant she meant it. "You're right," Abigail said. "Then put it back." "I will if you want me to." Abigail set the jars down on the shelf slowly. "But Jo, the preserved fruit has been in front of the dried beans for 3 months, and every time someone reaches for beans, they knock the fruit forward. 2 jars have hairline cracks from it. If those jars fail this winter—" "I know how to run this kitchen," Jo said. "I know you do. I have been running this kitchen since my mother died. I was 14 years old and I kept this family fed and clothed, and I did not ask for anyone to come in here and—" She stopped. Her jaw was tight. "Put it back the way it was." Abigail looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up the jars and put them back exactly where they had been. She put everything back. She worked in silence, and Jo stood in the doorway and watched her do it. And when it was done, Abigail stepped out of the pantry and said, "I'll leave the pantry to you." "The whole kitchen," Jo said. A pause. "All right, the whole kitchen." Jo waited for the argument, the defense, the explanation of why she was just trying to help. It didn't come. Abigail went and sat at the table and picked up the shirt she'd been mending and went back to work. Jo went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her palms against her knees and breathed. She didn't know what she wanted from that conversation. She'd won it, technically. She had said stop, and Abigail had stopped. She had said put it back, and Abigail had put it back. She had said the whole kitchen, and Abigail had said, all right. And Jo sat on her bed and felt terrible. Not because of anything Abigail had done, because of the hairline cracks in the fruit jars, which she hadn't known about. Because Abigail had known about them and had said it plainly and quietly and without using it as a weapon. She stayed upstairs until supper. At supper, Abigail served everyone else and then ate her small portion standing at the counter, same as always. And Jo watched her from across the room and thought about the fact that this woman had her whole meals standing at a counter in someone else's kitchen and hadn't complained about it once. She didn't say anything about the pantry, not that night. But the next morning she moved the beans to the front. She didn't tell Abigail she'd done it. She just did it, and Abigail came in and looked at the pantry and looked at Jo and nodded once, the same single receiving nod she'd given when Jo mentioned her mother's Sunday evening mending habit, and neither of them said a word about it. It was in its strange and sideways way the first real conversation they'd had. Cole saw none of this directly. He was in the fields, at the fence line, dealing with a property dispute with a neighboring rancher named Garrett, who had been slowly moving the boundary markers for the better part of a year, and felt that Cole's recent period of difficulty made this a good time to accelerate that process. Cole came home tired and short-tempered more evenings than not, and he sat at the dinner table and ate what was in front of him and answered Toby's questions in the distracted, partial way of a man whose mind was somewhere in the east pasture. But one evening, about 3 weeks after Abigail arrived, he came in from outside and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and looked at the room. He didn't say anything right away. He just stood there. Abigail was teaching Maggie how to fold laundry, not the forced, bright-voiced teaching of someone performing patience, but the quiet, matter-of-fact instruction of someone who considered this a practical skill worth having. Maggie kept folding the towels wrong, and Abigail kept showing her the right way without a trace of frustration. And Maggie kept getting distracted by the pattern on one of the towels and wandering off conversationally, and Abigail kept bringing her back without making her feel like she'd wandered. Cole stood in the doorway and watched this for probably 30 seconds. Then he said, "Abigail." She looked up. "You need anything? From town, before the weather closes in." She thought about it. "The needle I've been using is too thick for the finer mending. A smaller gauge would help. And if there's any spare lamp oil, that would—" "I'll get it," he said. Then he went upstairs, and that was the whole conversation. Jo, who had been in the corner darning one of Silas's socks and pretending not to listen, set down her work after he left and sat quietly for a moment. She was thinking about the fact that her father had just voluntarily offered to get something for Abigail, not because Abigail had asked, not because there was an obvious practical crisis, because he had walked through the door and seen the room and thought about what the person in it might need. Her father hadn't done that. Not since her mother died. Not for anyone. Jo picked her darning back up. Her hands were steadier than she expected. She was still angry. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. She was still angry, still watchful, still not ready to concede anything significant. This woman had arrived in a wedding dress with a traveling bag and 43 cents, and installed herself in their pantry room, and Jo had not asked for that and did not necessarily endorse it. But the beans were moved to the front of the shelf. The fruit jars with the hairline cracks had been moved to the back where they'd be used first. Toby's boot was fixed. The front step didn't shift anymore when you stepped on it. Maggie was learning to fold laundry. Jo could hold two things at once. She was 15 years old and she had been running a household since she was 14, and she was not simple. She could be angry and also admit that some things were better. She could be resistant and also notice that the resistance was costing her more every week. She could love her mother, miss her mother, ache for her mother in the specific wordless way that arrived sometimes without warning in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, and also recognize that what Abigail Brennan was doing was not replacement. She hadn't replaced anything. She hadn't tried to. She had just moved the beans to the front of the shelf and kept the fruit jars from cracking and made soup from a ham bone that everyone else had stopped seeing. The cold came earlier than usual that year. The last week of the third month, the temperature dropped 12 degrees in a single night and stayed there. And Cole came in from outside on a Friday morning with a look on his face that Jo recognized from the winter before. The look of a man doing arithmetic in his head that wasn't coming out right. He didn't say anything at breakfast. He just ate and drank his coffee and looked at the wall. After he left, Abigail stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. She looked at the food stores. She looked at the window where frost had traced itself across the glass in the night. She was very still, in the particular way she was still when she was thinking hard about something. "Jo," she said. Jo looked up from the dishes. "How bad do the winters get here?" Jo set down the plate she was drying. She looked at Abigail and thought about whether to be honest, because honesty meant admitting she was worried, and admitting she was worried meant letting Abigail into that. Then she thought about the hairline cracks in the fruit jars. "Bad," she said. "Last year we lost 3 of the chickens and half the root vegetables. The year before that—" She stopped. The year before that was the year her mother got sick, and the winter and the sickness had blurred together in her memory into a single long gray season she didn't like to visit. The roads closed sometimes for a week at a time, maybe more. Abigail nodded. She looked at the food stores again. "All right," she said quietly, and Jo didn't know what it meant yet. Didn't know what Abigail had already started doing, what she had been quietly doing since the second week, in the spaces between the other work, in the hours before anyone else was up, and the hours after everyone else was in bed. She would find out. They all would, but not yet. For now, the frost sat on the windows, and the wind had begun to move through the pine trees with a sound that meant it intended to stay. And somewhere in the kitchen, behind the ordinary face of the shelves and under the counter and in the places no one thought to look, something was being quietly built against the coming cold. The freeze came on a Sunday night without much warning. There had been signs, the kind that people who had lived through Montana winters learned to read. The particular stillness in the air the afternoon before, The way the horses pressed together in the barn without being prompted. The silence of birds that usually made noise well past dark. Cole had noticed. He'd said nothing at dinner, but Joe had seen him standing at the window after the children went to bed, looking north at the sky with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the way that meant he was calculating something and not liking the numbers. By Monday morning, the temperature had dropped to levels that made the air hurt to breathe. The water in the bucket near the barn door had frozen solid overnight. The creek at the back of the property, which had still been running on Saturday, had gone quiet. Cole came in from the barn at 6:30 with ice on his beard and said very calmly, "We need to take stock of the food." Abigail was already at the stove. She didn't turn around right away. "I've been doing that," she said. Cole pulled the ice from his beard with 2 fingers. "And?" "Sit down," she said. That made him stop. In the 6 weeks she'd been in this house, she had never told him to sit down. She had offered, suggested, asked, waited. But she had not told. He looked at her back and then pulled out a chair and sat down. She turned from the stove and put a cup of coffee in front of him. Then she went to the far end of the kitchen, to the counter under the window where she'd moved the flour bin when she reorganized, and she reached behind it and pulled out a flat piece of wood she'd been using as a writing surface, with a sheet of paper on it covered in her careful, small handwriting. She set it on the table in front of him. He looked at it. It was a list of everything in the house that could be used as food, not just the obvious stores in the pantry, but things she had been quietly accumulating and cataloging since the second week she arrived. Dried beans she'd found in a tin at the back of the cabinet that had been overlooked. The smoked pork she'd located in the cold store under a canvas and inventoried before it could spoil further. Preserved vegetables she'd moved to the coolest corner of the pantry to extend their life. Dried corn she'd traded Silas's labor for with the neighboring farm 2 weeks ago, when Silas had helped their boy fix a broken wheel on a hay wagon. Cole went through the list slowly, line by line. "You traded for corn?" he said. "Silas helped the aldermans with their wagon. I asked him if he'd mind accepting corn instead of cash wages since they were short. He didn't mind." Cole looked at the list again, then he looked up. "When did you do all this?" "Before the snow," she said, which was accurate but not complete. The truth was she'd started in her second week, in the hours before the household woke up and the hours after it went to bed, working quietly through the logic of a coming winter in a house that had not been stocked with any organized intention for well over a year. She had not made a production of it. She had just done it. "Abigail," he said. "Yes." "This is—" He stopped. He put his hand flat on the list and looked at the paper. Then he said, "This might get us through." "It should get us through," she said, "if we're careful." "How careful?" "I'll need to manage the portions." He looked at her. "You mean reduce them?" "For a while, yes." He was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up since morning and was moving against the house with a low, persistent sound like something testing the walls. Cole looked at the list again and then looked at the window, and Abigail could see him working through it. The weight of having 4 children in a house in a hard freeze with roads that couldn't be traveled and stores that were thinner than he'd thought before he sat down at this table. "What about your portion?" he asked. "I'll manage," she said. Something moved in his face, not quite suspicion, not quite understanding, something between the two. He looked at her for a moment and then looked back at the list because the list was easier. "All right," he said, "you manage it." Joe came in 15 minutes later, heard the tail end of the conversation, and stopped inside the door with snow still on her coat. She looked at the piece of wood with the list on it. She looked at Abigail. She looked at her father. "What is that?" she said. "Food inventory." Inventory, Cole said. Joe came to the table and read the list. She read it the way she read everything, completely and carefully, going back twice over the parts that surprised her. She stopped at the line about the smoked pork, then stopped at the dried corn, then stopped at the bottom where Abigail had written out estimated daily rations and projected how long each item would last under conservative use. She looked up at Abigail. "The smoked pork was under a canvas in the cold store. I didn't know it was still good." "It was borderline," Abigail said. "I treated it and repacked it. It should hold." "When did you do that?" "About 10 days ago." Joe stood with the list in her hand and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she set it down on the table and went to the stove and started the porridge for the children's breakfast, and didn't speak again until Toby came crashing downstairs wanting to know if school was canceled because of the snow. School was canceled because of the snow. The road into town was already impassable, which they confirmed when Silas went out on horseback mid-morning and came back an hour later saying the North Pass was drifted over and there was no way through without equipment they didn't have. Cole took this information with the stillness of a man who had been braced for it. "How long do you think?" he asked Silas. Silas pulled off his gloves. He was 16 and he was trying hard not to look scared, which meant he looked exactly as scared as he was. The alderman boy said last year the North Pass didn't clear until the second week of January. It was the 9th of December. "All right," Cole said. "All right." He said it twice, to himself more than anyone else. That first week of the freeze, the Mercer house settled into the particular rhythm of people confined together by weather and necessity. Toby, deprived of school and outdoor range, became a concentrated point of kinetic energy that Abigail redirected by teaching him to whittle, which he immediately used to make a lopsided dog-shaped piece of wood that he named after the dog they didn't have. Maggie stopped complaining about wearing Toby's old socks and started wearing them as a point of pride. Silas retreated to the barn more than was strictly necessary, and Cole let him because sometimes the barn was the best place for a 16-year-old with too much feeling and nowhere to put it. Joe ran the kitchen with Abigail beside her, and the dynamic between them shifted in the way things shifted when external pressure was applied. Not resolved, exactly, but rearranged. There was too much to do to maintain careful distance. Joe needed to know where things were, and Abigail had reorganized enough of the house that some of those answers lived in Abigail's head. Abigail needed to know what the children would actually eat and what they'd refuse, which varieties of tired and hungry produced what behaviors, which things Joe's mother had done that Joe was still doing because they worked, and which things she'd been doing out of habit and would actually be relieved to change. They talked, practically, functionally, sometimes with friction and sometimes without. It wasn't warmth yet, but it was something. On the 4th day of the freeze, Abigail quietly began reducing her own portion at dinner. Not dramatically. She wasn't performing sacrifice. She simply served herself last and served herself less, with the specific invisibility of someone who has practice at going unnoticed. She ate standing at the counter, same as always, and nobody at the table had a direct sight line to her bowl. But Joe had angles on everything in that kitchen. She always had. She saw it on the 4th day and said nothing. She saw it again on the 5th and on the 6th, and said nothing those days either, because she was not sure what she was looking at yet. She told herself it was portion management. Abigail was being careful with the stores, same as she was asking everyone to be. By the 8th day, she knew it wasn't that. By the 8th day, she had done the math the way Abigail had done the math, the same careful inventory arithmetic, and she understood that what Abigail was doing was not caution. She was taking less than her own ration. She had been taking less than her own ration since before the freeze, probably, since the beginning maybe, eating the smallest portion at the table every single night, and then standing at the counter and eating less than that. Joe stood at the counter on the 8th night after everyone else had gone to bed, looking at the food stores, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she wasn't ready for. She pressed her palm flat against the shelf and breathed through it. The second week of the freeze brought a development nobody had accounted for, which was that Toby got sick. Not dangerously sick, not the kind of sick that made everyone's blood go cold, but a solid, miserable chest cold that settled in and refused to leave, that had him coughing through the nights and running a fever that stayed just below the threshold of crisis and just above the threshold of comfort. Abigail sat with him the first night. Joe came to relieve her at 2 in the morning and found her still there, awake, with Toby's extra blanket tucked around him and her own shawl over her shoulders because she'd given her blanket to him and the room was cold. "Go sleep," Joe said. "I'm fine." "You've been up since 5. So have you." They looked at each other across Toby's bed. He was asleep, finally, his breathing rough but even. The candle on the bedside table was burning low. "He's going to be all right," Abigail said. It wasn't a reassurance offered for comfort. It was an assessment, the practical, evaluating kind that Joe trusted more than sentiment. "I know," Joe said. A pause. The candle guttered. Abigail reached out and steadied it. Go sleep, Joe said again, and this time her voice was different. Not an argument, not an order, just a girl telling a tired woman to rest because someone needed to say it. Abigail looked at her for a moment. Then she got up, folded the shawl over the chair, and went to bed. Joe sat with Toby until morning. She was thinking about the shawl on the chair, about the blanket on Toby that had come off of Abigail's cot, about 43 cents and a train ticket and a man on a platform who had laughed. She was thinking about what it meant to come from nothing and still give things away. Toby recovered by the end of the second week. His color came back, and then his appetite came back, and then his personality came back, which meant peace and quiet went away. But that was a price the family paid cheerfully. On the day he declared himself fully recovered by eating an entire bowl of porridge and most of Maggie's, Silas came in from the barn with a look on his face that Joe had not seen in a long time. Not the closed, distant expression that had become his default. Something more open, more uncertain. He sat down at the kitchen table and waited until it was just him and Abigail in the room. She was at the counter, working on the mending. She looked up when she registered his presence. She waited. The north fence post on the east side is cracked through, he said. I've been propping it with a piece of the old rail, but it won't hold once the ground softens in spring. What do you need to fix it right? She asked. Proper post, and time to set it before the thaw, which we don't have. She nodded. She looked at the mending in her hands and then set it down. I'll mention it to your father. He knows, Silas said. A pause. He has a lot on his mind, Abigail said carefully. He's always had a lot on his mind. Silas looked at the table. His jaw was tight in the way it got when he was navigating something he didn't have language for yet. Before Mama died, she used to write things down for him. Lists. Things that needed doing, things he'd forget to think about because he was thinking about other things. He'd complain that she was managing him. Silas stopped. He was wrong about that. Abigail was very still. Silas looked up at her. He was 16 and he had his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness, and he had been carrying something in his chest for 14 months that was starting, finally, to get too heavy for one person. I'm not saying you're her, he said. That's not what I'm saying. I know, Abigail said. He stopped, looked at the table again. The fence post needs a proper fix. I'll write it down, Abigail said, so it doesn't get forgotten. He nodded. Then he got up and went back to the barn, and Abigail sat at the counter for a long moment with the mending in her lap and her eyes on the window, and something in her face that was careful and private and not meant for anyone else to see. She wrote it down. The real crisis came at the end of the third week. The cold store, the underground cellar behind the house where the temperature stayed low enough to preserve root vegetables through winter, flooded. Not from snowmelt, which came later. From a spring underground that no one had known was there, or that everyone had known was there and forgotten about, or that had never mattered before because the winters hadn't been cold enough long enough to drive it sideways through the stone floor. The water came up slow, but it came up committed, and by the time Cole noticed the soft ground around the cellar door and went to check, 8 inches of cold water covered the floor. They got most of it out. The potatoes, the turnips, the preserved beets. Cole and Silas worked for 3 hours in water up to their shins while Joe organized what came out of the cellar and Abigail assessed what could be saved. Not all of it could be saved. The turnips at the bottom had been sitting in water long enough to begin softening. Some of the potato sacks had wicked moisture up into the lower layers. They spread everything across the kitchen floor and went through it piece by piece in the way you went through things when you couldn't afford to be sentimental about it. Keeping what was firm, setting aside what was borderline to be used immediately, discarding what was lost. Cole stood in the kitchen afterward with wet boots and a face that was doing the arithmetic again. The bad arithmetic. Tell me where we are, he said to Abigail. She told him. She was honest because he needed honesty more than he needed comfort, and she had understood that about him from the first week. The numbers were tighter now. Not impossible, but tight. They would need to cut portions further. The borderline potatoes needed to be used in the next 4 days. Can you do it? He said. Yes, she said. But Cole... He looked at her. Everyone eats at the table, she said. full portions for the children, reduced for us, but at the table, where they can see. He understood what she was saying, that the children needed to see normalcy, that the performance of adequacy was part of managing a hard winter with young people in the house, that if Maggie saw adults going hungry, it would frighten her in a way that was harder to recover from than actual hunger. "And you?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "I'll manage." He said, "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without flinching, which was not something most people did when Cole Mercer was doing that particular brand of looking. Then he turned and went to change his boots. But he stood at the bottom of the stairs for just a second longer than he needed to. Just a beat. And then he went upstairs. Joe had heard the whole thing. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the last of the borderline potatoes in a pile in front of her, sorting through them, and she had heard every word. Her hands had gone still about halfway through, and she had not started them moving again, sorting through them, and she had heard every word. Her hands had gone still about halfway through, and she had not started them moving again. She looked at Abigail standing in the middle of the kitchen. Abigail had her back to her, looking at the depleted stores with her arms at her sides and her shoulders straight, and Joe looked at the line of her spine and thought about everything she had not said in this house over the past 6 weeks. Everything she had done instead of saying, the corn traded for with Silas's labor, the smoked pork repacked, the fruit jars with the hairline cracks moved to the front to be used before they failed, the blanket on Toby's bed, the shawl on the chair, the portions she had been quietly shrinking since before the freeze started, without asking anyone's permission and without asking anyone to notice. Joe's throat felt tight. She pressed it down. "Abigail," she said. Abigail turned around. "Sit down and eat something," Joe said. "A proper portion. Right now, before you start on the potatoes." Abigail opened her mouth. "Don't," Joe said. "Don't tell me you'll manage. Sit down." A long pause. The wind pushed at the house. The fire in the stove ticked. Somewhere upstairs, Maggie was singing something tuneless and cheerful to herself, the way she did when she was playing alone. Abigail sat down. Joe put a bowl in front of her, a proper one, the kind she'd been giving the children. She didn't say anything else, and Abigail didn't thank her, and the two of them sat in the kitchen with the sorted potatoes between them and the storm outside and the sound of Maggie singing upstairs. And it was not comfortable exactly, and it was not resolved, and the winter was not over. But something had shifted, not loudly, not completely, the way ice shifted in a river, internal, structural, the kind of movement you felt before you saw it. Joe picked up a potato and started peeling it. After a moment, Abigail picked up one too. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The kitchen was warm enough for now, and there was still food on the shelves, and outside the storm was doing what storms did, which was exactly what it wanted, with no concern for the people inside. But inside, two people who had been moving carefully around each other for 6 weeks were finally sitting at the same table, doing the same work, on the same side of it. That was the night the house began to change. Not the ranch, not the circumstances, not the hard facts of a Montana winter with flooded stores and cracked fence posts and roads that wouldn't open for another 3 weeks. Just the house. Just the feeling inside it. That was enough for now. That was more than enough. The North Pass cleared on a Thursday, 3 weeks and 2 days after it had closed. Silas came in from his morning check with snow still on his hat and said, "Road's open," in the flat, factual tone he used for information he knew mattered, but didn't want to perform emotion about. Cole looked up from the table where he'd been going over the ranch accounts for the 4th time in a week, put the pencil down, and let out a breath that had been sitting in his chest for a while. They got into town 2 days later. All of them, which was unusual. Cole typically left the younger children home when roads were uncertain, and the trip was purely practical. But Maggie had been asking to go to town since the 2nd week of the freeze with the relentless, patient persistence of a 5-year-old who understood that repetition was her primary leverage. And Toby hadn't been off the property since before Christmas. And Cole looked at his children at breakfast that morning and said, "Get your coats, all of you." Abigail started to step back. "You too," Cole said, without looking at her. She put on her coat. The town looked the same as it had the day she'd arrived, which felt strange because she was not the same as she had been the day she'd arrived. And things that have changed, you have a way of seeming like they should have changed everything around them too. The station was there. The sheriff's office was there. The general store with its window display of winter goods, half of which had been bought out by people in the same situation as the Mercers. Cole went to the general store for supplies. Silas went with him to carry. Toby immediately located the only other 10-year-old boy visible within a 50-yard radius and gravitated toward him with the magnetic force of children who had been cooped up too long. Maggie held Abigail's hand without asking permission and without making a declaration about it. Just slipped her small fingers into Abigail's palm and held on, the way Maggie did most things, with complete confidence that the world would accommodate her. Joe walked beside Abigail and said nothing for the first half of the main street, which was her version of companionship. Then she said, "Mrs. Alderman is waving at you." Abigail looked. The woman from the neighboring farm was standing outside the dry goods store, and she was, in fact, waving. Not the polite acknowledgement wave, but the come here wave, the purposeful one. "She probably wants to talk about Silas and the wagon," Abigail said. "Probably," Joe said, but there was something in her tone that suggested she thought it might be more than that. It was more than that. Mrs. Alderman was a broad, practical woman in her 50s who had survived 30 years of Montana frontier and wore that survival plainly on her face. She shook Abigail's hand with the grip of someone who judged people by their handshakes and was pleased with this one. "I heard you got through the freeze all right," she said. "Cole's place." "We managed," Abigail said. "Harriet Bowden told me about the food inventory you'd put together before the cold came in." Mrs. Alderman looked at her with the direct assessment of a woman who did not have time for anything other than directness. "Said Cole told her husband you'd been storing things away since your second week." Abigail felt Joe go very still beside her. "I just paid attention to what was there," Abigail said carefully. "That's the whole job," Mrs. Alderman said, with the tone of someone who had been saying this to people who didn't understand it for 30 years. She looked at Joe. "Your girl here, is she the one that's been running the kitchen?" "Yes," Abigail said. "Good girl," Mrs. Alderman said to Joe directly, with zero condescension and complete sincerity. "Your mama would be proud." She looked back at Abigail. "You need anything going forward, you come ask. We owe Cole Mercer a good turn, and I prefer paying debts before they get stale." She shook Abigail's hand again and went back into the dry goods store. Joe stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Maggie was examining a crack in the boardwalk with the focused attention of someone conducting a geological survey. The street was busy around them, people reclaiming the town after the freeze, running errands that had backed up for weeks, talking loudly with the relief of people who had been isolated and were glad to be done with it. "She said Mama would be proud," Joe said, quietly, not a question. "She meant it," Abigail said. "I know she meant it." Joe looked down the street. Her jaw worked slightly. "That's why I'm saying it." They stood there for another moment, the three of them, Abigail, Joe, and Maggie, who had moved on to examining a different crack. And then Maggie looked up and said, "Can we get candy?" And the moment dissolved back into ordinary life, which was probably the best place for it. The weeks after the thaw were different from the weeks before it. Not dramatically different. The Mercer Ranch was not a place that did things dramatically. It was a place where change happened in the spaces between events, in the accumulation of small adjustments that you only noticed if you stood back far enough to see the whole picture. But different, undeniably. Silas started talking at dinner. Not much, not every night, but enough. A sentence here about the fence repair he'd managed, a question there about something he'd read in one of Cole's old newspapers, once a lengthy and entirely unprompted account of a dispute between two of the horses that he told with such dry, straight-faced specificity that even Cole laughed, the real kind, the involuntary kind that caught him by surprise. Joe started teaching Abigail to make Eleanor's biscuits. This was not a small thing. Joe did not announce it as anything more than practical. "We're low on the other bread and biscuits are faster." But she got out her mother's recipe, the one she had committed to memory and never needed to write down, and she stood beside Abigail at the counter and talked her through it with the same direct, no-shortcuts manner she applied to everything. "More lard than you think," she said. "Most people underfat the biscuits and then wonder why they're dry." "How much more?" "Another spoonful, maybe two. Mama always said the recipe lied about the lard. Abigail added another spoonful. Now, Joe said, you can't overwork it. That's the other thing people do wrong. You mix it just until it comes together and then you stop, even if it looks a little rough. Even if it looks wrong. Especially if it looks wrong. Looking wrong is fine. Overworked is not fixable. They made the biscuits. They came out right, not identical to Eleanor's, which was a thing that was never going to be achievable and which neither of them pretended to aim for, but right in their own terms, properly fat and a little rough on the outside and soft when you broke them open. Toby ate 3 without pausing between them. Maggie said they were the good kind, which in her vocabulary was the highest available rating. Cole looked at the biscuits on the table and then looked at Joe and then at Abigail and didn't say anything, which was its own kind of language. Abigail learned it. She had been learning it for months. The particular vocabulary of this family, the things that got said sideways or not said at all but meant something. The difference between Cole's silences, of which there were many varieties. The silence that meant he was troubled. The silence that meant he was moved. The silence that meant he was working up to something he didn't know how to start. She recognized the third kind one evening in late February, when the children had gone to bed and the kitchen was quiet, and Cole sat at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold without him drinking it. She was mending. She was always mending. There was always something. The letter from the Hartwell family, he said. She looked up. She had been waiting for this, not with anxiety exactly, but with the knowledge that it was coming, the way you knew a conversation was going to happen before it did. The job offer, she said. Steady wages. Room of your own. He looked at the cold coffee. Hartwell's a decent family. Got money. House in town. He paused. It's a better situation than this one. She kept her hands moving on the mending. You opened my letter. It was addressed to me. Asked if I'd release you from our arrangement. She hadn't known that part. She looked at him. They came asking around town, he said. Mrs. Alderman apparently told half of Coldwater Creek about the food inventory before the freeze. Hartwell's wife has been looking for someone capable to run their household for 2 years. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. It's a real offer, Abigail. I know it's real. I told them I couldn't speak for you, that the choice was yours. She set the mending in her lap. The fire in the stove had burned down to the reliable quiet heat of late evening, the kind that asked nothing of you. Outside, the last of the winter held the hills but loosely now, and spring was coming in the way spring came up here. Slowly and without announcement, just a slow softening of everything. What do you want me to do? She asked. Cole looked up from the coffee. He seemed surprised by the question, which told her he had not been prepared for it. He had prepared to present information. He had not prepared to be asked. That's not... He stopped, started again. What do you want to do? I asked you first, she said. A long pause. The stove ticked. Somewhere outside, an owl made one sound and then was quiet. I want... Cole stopped again. He put the coffee cup down. He looked at his hands for a moment, the rough hands she'd noticed the first day in the sheriff's office. The children have done better since you came. And I know some of that is just time. It's been longer. They've had more time to, but it's also you. And I... He stopped a third time, and this time the stopping was different, more final, like a man who has run out of the particular language he's been trying to use, and has to either switch languages or give up. He gave up on the careful version and said the plain one. I don't want you to go. Abigail looked at him. But I'm not going to tell you to stay if the other life is what you want, he said. You came here with nothing and you've been eating half rations for 3 months and sleeping in a pantry, and I know that, Abigail. I know what you've had here and what you'd have there, and it's not the same. She was quiet for a moment. The owl outside made another sound, a different one this time. When I was on that train, she said slowly, coming out here, I thought I knew what I was going toward. I had the letters, and I thought I knew what kind of life it was going to be. She looked at the mending in her lap. I was wrong about that, but I was also wrong about what I needed. I thought I needed someone to choose me, to see me and decide I was worth the trouble. She paused. I don't think that's what I needed anymore. Cole waited. What I needed, she said, was somewhere that needed what I actually have. Not what I look like in a photograph. Not some version of me that fit a particular picture. She looked up. This house needed what I have. These children needed it. You needed it. She let that sit for a moment. That's different from being chosen because someone decided you were pretty enough. Cole looked at her steadily. You're going to turn down steady wages and your own room. I'm going to turn down steady wages and my own room, she confirmed. He let out a breath. It wasn't relief exactly. It was more complicated than that. Relief and something heavier underneath it. The acknowledgement of what this woman had done in this house over these months and what it had cost her and what it had given back, and the particular weight of recognizing something valuable that you hadn't understood you had. The pantry room, he said. That's not permanent. There's the room above the barn store that Silas doesn't use. It's got a window. A window sounds good, she said. He nodded. Then he picked up the cold coffee and drank it anyway, the way people drank cold coffee when the alternative was doing something with their hands that they didn't know how to do. Jo found out the next morning. She found out because Toby found out first from Silas, who had apparently been awake and heard more of the kitchen conversation than either adult had intended. And by breakfast, the information had traveled through the household at the speed that significant news always traveled in a small house with children, which was immediately, and with minimal accuracy, but sufficient emotional weight. Toby said, "Is it true you're not leaving?" with his spoon halfway to his mouth and his whole face open with 10-year-old hope. "It's true," Abigail said. Toby put the spoon down and looked at Silas with an expression that said, "This is good, right?" And Silas looked back with the expression of a 16-year-old who was not going to perform feeling about it, but was absolutely having it. Maggie said, "I knew you weren't leaving." "Did you?" Abigail said. "You put Mama's socks in the drawer." Everyone looked at Maggie, who looked serenely back at them as though she had said something completely obvious, which, in her 5-year-old logic, she had. There had been a pair of Eleanor's socks in the pantry room, left there from before, overlooked in the clearing out after she died. And sometime in the past few weeks, Abigail had folded them and put them in the drawer of the small dresser rather than moving them out. Maggie had apparently noted this at some point with the absolute attentiveness of a small child who missed nothing and had arrived at her own conclusion. Abigail looked at Maggie. She didn't say anything. Jo had not said anything since Toby announced the news. She was sitting at her place at the table, eating her breakfast, and her face was doing the same thing Cole's face did when he was working through something internally and hadn't landed yet. Abigail gave her the space for it. She had learned Jo's rhythms well enough by now to know that pushing produced nothing useful and that Jo would get there when Jo got there. She got there that afternoon. Abigail was in the kitchen working on the list for the spring planting, thinking through the kitchen garden, what had been in it before, what had grown well and what hadn't, what they needed more of given the winter they'd just had. When Jo came in from outside and went directly to the back of the house and came back carrying something, she set it on the table in front of Abigail. It was a book, not large, such the size of a hymnal maybe, with a cover that had been dark green once and was now a worn, soft gray-green with use. The spine had been repaired with cloth tape, carefully, by someone who knew how to take care of things. The pages, when she looked, were dense with handwriting, close and neat, recipes and notations, and small observations about what worked and what didn't, and what time of year and how much, with occasional quick notes in the margins that were different from the recipe text, more personal, the kind of thing you wrote because it occurred to you in the moment, and you put it down before it left you. Eleanor Mercer's handwriting. "Jo," Abigail said. "I know what it is," Jo said. Her voice was controlled, but just barely. The kind of control that was active and effortful. "I know what I'm doing. I want you to have it." Abigail looked at the book. She looked at Jo. She was very careful with what she said next because she understood exactly what she was looking at and exactly what it was costing the girl standing in front of her. "I can't take this from you," she said quietly. "You're not taking it. I'm giving it." Jo crossed her arms over her chest and looked at the window, then back. She would have wanted someone to use it, It's been sitting in the trunk for 14 months, and nobody's been using it, and that's... Her voice caught slightly. She pressed through it. That's not what it's for. It's for the kitchen. It's for this house. She looked at Abigail directly. It's for whoever is going to be in this kitchen. A long silence. Joe, Abigail said, and her voice was careful. I'm not your mother. I'm not going to be your mother. You know that. I know that, Joe said, and she said it with the quick firmness of someone who had thought this through and was not confused about it. She was my mother. I'm not confused about what you are. She uncrossed her arms. You're the person who sat with Toby when he was sick and gave him your blanket. You're the person who moved the beans to the front of the shelf and saved the fruit jars and didn't say a word about the rations you weren't eating. She stopped, steadied. You're the person who told me I carried a burden no child should have had to carry alone. Nobody ever said that to me, not once in 14 months. She had said that 3 weeks ago, in the cold kitchen, in a moment that had come sideways and unexpectedly after Toby's illness and the flooded cellar and 6 weeks of accumulated pressure. Joe had come apart very quietly, the way she did everything, without spectacle, without drama, in the practical middle of a practical conversation. And Abigail had said, very simply, you have been carrying something that was too heavy for one person. And Joe had stood at the kitchen counter and cried, also very quietly, for about 2 minutes, and then had wiped her face and gone back to what she was doing. Neither of them had mentioned it again until now. Abigail looked at the recipe book on the table. She looked at Joe. I'll use it carefully, she said. I know you will, Joe said. Then, slightly rough. The biscuit recipe is on the 3rd page. The one we made is right, by the way. You did it right. We did it right, Abigail said. Joe looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, once, the same receiving nod that Abigail had used with her all those months ago. The first one, when Joe had mentioned her mother's Sunday mending. It had come back around. She went upstairs. Abigail sat at the kitchen table with her hand resting on the cover of the recipe book and the spring planting list in front of her and the stove ticking and the house around her doing what houses did when they had enough people in them and enough warmth and enough reasons to stay together. It wasn't perfect. Cole was still fighting with Garrett over the eastern boundary and probably would be for another season. Silas still went to the barn when he had too much feeling and not enough words. Toby would undoubtedly get into something before spring was properly underway. Maggie needed new boots. The window in the room above the barn store needed resealing before summer. There was so much that still needed doing. There was always so much that needed doing. Abigail opened the recipe book to the 3rd page, found the biscuits, and read her predecessor's neat handwriting. More lard than the recipe says, margin note, barely legible, written in a hurry. And she almost smiled. She put the spring planting list beside it and started writing. Outside, the last of winter's grip on the hills had gone soft at the edges, and somewhere down the slope, the creek that had been silent for months was running again, slow and cold, and absolutely certain of where it was going. Spring came to the Mercer Ranch the way it always did in the high country, reluctantly, in fits and starts, with cold nights that refused to acknowledge what the calendar said, and warm afternoons that made you believe things before they were ready to be believed. The kitchen garden was Abigail's first project. She had been planning it since February, studying the layout, talking to Joe about what Eleanor had planted and where, cross-referencing that with the soil conditions she'd observed through the fall and what they'd run short of during the freeze. The garden that had existed before was a good one. Eleanor had known what she was doing, but it had been laid out for a family that had more outside help than this one currently did, and some of it needed rethinking for what the Mercers actually were now. She didn't redesign it without Joe. That was the thing she had learned, or rather confirmed, because she'd understood it at some level from the beginning, that the way to earn a place in a family was not to come in and improve things over the family's objections. It was to do the improving alongside them, slowly enough that they could see themselves in the result. So she and Joe planned the kitchen garden together on the kitchen table over 3 evenings in March, with Eleanor's recipe book nearby for reference because Eleanor had made notes about what preserved well and what didn't, and those notes were as useful for planning decisions as they were for cooking ones. They argued about the placement of the bean rows, which was a genuine argument with a practical disagreement at its center, and Joe won it, which was the right outcome because Joe was correct about the afternoon shade and Abigail had been wrong. She told Joe she'd been wrong. Plainly, without softening it into something more comfortable. Joe had looked at her for a moment after that and said, "Mama used to do that. Just say it straight." She hadn't said anything else and Abigail hadn't asked her to. Some things you received and held quietly. By the time the ground was soft enough to work, Silas had repaired the east fence post with a proper replacement that Cole had brought back from town, and Toby had broken two things and fixed one of them without being asked, which was an improvement over his previous average. Maggie had learned to fold laundry correctly, mostly, and had opinions about which towels were folded wrong that she shared with a confidence that suggested a future in household management or possibly law. The room above the barn store had been resealed and swept out and furnished with the small dresser from the pantry room and a proper bed frame that Silas had repaired from the barn's collection of salvaged things. It wasn't large, but it had the window Cole had promised, and from that window on a clear morning you could see the creek and the far hills and the particular quality of light that came across the valley in early spring, the kind that made everything look like it was at the beginning of something. Abigail had moved Eleanor's socks to the drawer in that dresser too. Nobody mentioned this, but everyone noticed. The trip to town in April was for supplies and for the spring land registry filing, which Cole needed to do in person to contest Garrett's boundary encroachment before it became legally established. He had been building his case over the winter with the help of Silas, who had a meticulous mind for detail that had found its outlet in cataloging every discrepancy between the original deed measurements and the current marker positions. The lawyer in town, a dry and efficient man named Holt, had looked at Silas's documentation and said, in his dry and efficient way, "This is thorough," which from Holt constituted something close to amazement. The boundary case would take more time. These things always did, but the filing gave Cole a legal standing he hadn't had before, and he came out of Holt's office looking lighter than he'd gone in. Abigail was waiting outside with Maggie, who was engaged in her ongoing geological survey of Coldwater Creek's sidewalk infrastructure. Joe and Toby had gone to the dry goods store. Silas was at the feed supplier. Cole came down the steps and stopped when he saw her face. "What?" he said. She nodded down the street. He followed her look. Thaddeus Vance was standing outside the barbershop 40 yards away, talking to another man. He was well-dressed, same as he had been in November, boots polished, the kind of man who maintained his appearance as a matter of principle or vanity. It was sometimes hard to tell the difference. He hadn't seen them yet. Cole looked at Vance and then looked at Abigail. She was watching Vance with an expression that was difficult to read. Not anger, not pain exactly, more like she was looking at a thing from a distance and trying to remember why it had once seemed large. "We can go the other way," Cole said. "No," she said. "We don't need to." She picked up Maggie with a matter-of-factness that startled Maggie slightly, and then apparently suited her because she settled on Abigail's hip and resumed her survey of the street from a higher vantage point. They walked in Vance's direction because the general store was in that direction, and they had a list. Vance saw them at about 20 yards. She watched him see her. The quick recognition, then the adjustment as he registered who was beside her, the children, the overall picture of what he was looking at. Something moved in his face that she couldn't entirely name. Calculation, maybe. Or something more human than that. Something closer to the feeling of understanding what you gave up only after you'd given it up. He stepped toward them. She kept walking. "Miss Brennan?" he said. She stopped. Cole stopped beside her. Maggie looked at Vance with the direct assessment of someone who had not been introduced and was forming opinions anyway. "Mr. Vance," Abigail said. He looked at her, then at Cole, then at Maggie on her hip and the ease with which she was carried and the ease with which the child sat there, which told its own story to anyone paying attention. He looked back at Abigail. "You're well?" he said. Not a question. An observation made with a complexity underneath it that he was choosing not to speak directly. "I am," she said. A pause. The street moved around them, the ordinary business of a spring morning in a small town, people with errands and purposes and no interest in other people's complicated histories. He said, "I want to," and then stopped and she could see him working out how to say something that had no good phrasing, that was going to come out wrong regardless of how he arranged it. She saved him the trouble, not for his sake, just because she was done spending time on it. "You don't need to," she said. She said it without coldness and without warmth, the way you said things that were simply true. "It's all right, Mr. Vance. I mean that." He looked at her with an expression she hadn't expected from him, which was something close to genuine. "I wasn't decent to you," he said, "in front of people. That wasn't... I shouldn't have done it that way." "No," she agreed. "You shouldn't have." She shifted Maggie slightly on her hip. Cole had said nothing through this exchange. He was standing beside her with his hands in his coat pockets, not hostile, not performing anything, just present in the solid and unglamorous way that was entirely his own. "But I'm not going to tell you it ruined my life," Abigail continued, "because it didn't. It put me somewhere I needed to be." She looked at him steadily. "So we're square, Mr. Vance. You can let it go." He stood on the sidewalk and looked at her, and she looked back, and then Maggie said, with the perfect timing of a 5-year-old, "That man has very shiny boots," in a tone of mild, scholarly interest. Something almost like a laugh moved across Vance's face. He tipped his hat once and stepped back. And that was the end of it. Abigail turned and walked toward the general store, and Cole walked beside her, and Maggie continued her observations from the elevation of Abigail's hip, and none of them looked back. They were half a block away when Cole said, "You didn't need me to say anything." "No," she said. "I was going to." "I know you were." He was quiet for a moment. "How'd you know?" She glanced at him. "The way you put your hands in your pockets," she said. "You do that when you're holding something back." Cole looked down at his coat pockets. He was quiet for another moment, and she could see him deciding whether to say something, doing that particular internal negotiation of his, and she waited for it the way she had learned to wait for it. "I've been trying to find the right time to say something," he said, "and I've come to the conclusion that there isn't a right time. There's just time, and you say it, and it's awkward, and then it's said." "That's usually how it works," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped because he did, and Maggie accepted the pause philosophically. "I want to ask you to stay," he said. "Not the way I asked before. Not because we need the help or because the children are doing better. I want to ask you as something more than what we've been." She looked at him. His face was doing the thing it did when he had used up all his comfortable language and was in territory he didn't navigate well. He looked back at her with the directness that was, she had come to understand, his version of vulnerability. He couldn't soften things the way some people could, couldn't dress them up. So when he said the true thing, he said it flat and plain and let it sit there and hoped it landed. "I'm not a man who's good with words," he said. "I know. I'm not easy to live with. I know that too. The ranch it's not settled. The boundary case is going to drag on. The east pasture needs work I can't afford this season. There's always something." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not offering you a comfortable life." "Cole," she said. "What?" "You're talking yourself out of asking the question." He stopped. "Ask the question," she said. He took a breath. "Will you marry me?" Not phrased as a question exactly, said like a fact he was placing in the space between them and waiting to see what she did with it. Which was, she thought, the most Cole Mercer way to propose that she could have imagined. Maggie had gone very still on her hip, listening with the absolute attentiveness of a small child who understood that something important was happening and was storing it for future use. Abigail looked at Cole. She thought about the train and the 43 cents and the platform in November and the man walking away. She thought about the pantry room and the thin blanket and the small portions she had eaten standing at the counter while the family sat at the table. She thought about Joe's face when she handed over the recipe book, and Silas cataloging fence measurements with his careful, methodical mind, and Toby naming a lopsided wooden dog, and Maggie in the oversized socks. She thought about the difference between being chosen because you fit someone's picture and being known because someone had paid attention. "Yes," she said. Maggie said, "Yes," with considerably more volume because she had been waiting. Cole looked at his youngest daughter. "Were you listening to all of that?" "Yes." Maggie said, unapologetically. Something broke open in Cole's face that she had not seen before, not in all these months. A kind of uncomplicated relief. The face of a man who has been braced for a long time and has finally, in one ordinary moment on a sidewalk in spring, been allowed to stop. He reached out and put his hand over hers, the one not occupied with supporting Maggie. His hand was rough and warm, and not graceful about it. He just put it there, flat and certain. They stood on the sidewalk in Coldwater Creek in April, with a 5-year-old between them who was already planning what she was going to tell the others, and the street went on around them, ordinary and indifferent and entirely unaware that anything significant had just happened in its midst. That evening, they told the children at dinner. The responses were characteristically their own. Toby said, "Does that mean you're staying forever?" And when Abigail said yes, he went back to eating with the satisfied air of someone whose preferred outcome had been confirmed. Silas said nothing immediately. He looked at his plate. Then he looked at his father. Then he looked at Abigail with the considered, deliberate look he used when he was deciding something, and he said, "All right," in a tone that contained significantly more than 2 words, and went back to his food. Maggie said she had known since the socks, and nobody bothered to argue with her. Joe said nothing at the table. After dinner, while the younger children were getting ready for bed and Cole was outside checking on the horses, she stayed in the kitchen and helped Abigail with the dishes, the same as any other night, the same rhythm they'd built up over months of the same task. They worked through most of the dishes in the familiar quiet. Then Joe said, "Are you scared?" Abigail considered the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "Some," she said. "Yes." "Of what?" "Getting it wrong. Missing things I should catch. There's a lot of history in this house that I'm not part of. I'm always going to be working around the edges of things I didn't see." Joe was quiet for a moment, drying a plate with the slow care she gave to things she was thinking through. "She wasn't always easy to live with either," she said. "Mama? She had a temper, and she held grudges longer than she should have, and she and Pa used to argue about money in a way that was hard to listen to." She set the plate down. "I'm not telling you that so you feel better about replacing her. I'm telling you so you know she was a person, not just a thing that's gone." She looked at Abigail. "And so you know I understand the difference." Abigail set down the pot she was washing. She looked at Joe, 15 years old, going on 40, carrying herself with the posture of someone who had learned to be responsible before they learned to be young, and was only now, slowly, tentatively, starting to figure out that both things could coexist. "She did a good job with you," Abigail said. Joe's jaw went tight in the way it did when something landed and she wasn't ready for it. She looked at the window, looked back. "Don't make me cry in the kitchen," she said, with a roughness in her voice that wasn't quite managing what it was attempting. "Too late," Abigail said. Joe made a sound that was approximately a laugh and approximately something else, and pressed the back of her wrist against her eye quickly, and then picked up the next dish and dried it with unnecessary vigor. They finished the dishes. Cole came back in from the horses and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the two of them standing at the counter, side by side in the ordinary lamplit kitchen, and his face did the thing it sometimes did that he didn't know she'd noticed. Went very still and then settled, like a man arriving somewhere he'd been looking for without knowing he was looking. He didn't say anything. He poured himself water and sat at the table and picked up one of Silas's old newspapers and read it. And the kitchen was quiet and warm and full of people who had come to be in this particular room by paths that were neither direct nor planned, that had involved loss and hardship and, in some cases, public humiliation on a train platform in November. Abigail dried her hands on the dishcloth and placed Eleanor's recipe book back beside the stove where it lived now, where she had put it the day after Joe gave it to her, in the spot that made the most practical sense and also, she thought, the most right sense. She looked at the book for a moment. Then she looked at the kitchen, the reorganized shelves, the beans at the front, the lamp burning with the oil Cole had brought from town months ago when he'd asked unprompted what she needed, the mending basket in the corner, the stove that she had learned the temperament of, the way it ran hot on the left side and needed watching in the first 20 minutes of a new fire. The table where 5 people ate dinner every night, and now 8 hands to pass things, and 4 voices talking over each other, and one voice that said very little but said it with weight. This kitchen, this house. She had arrived with 43 cents and no plan, and a dress with a mended cuff, and she had asked only for a roof and a meal, and she had meant it honestly, without strategy, because that was what she had, and she had learned not to ask for more than what she had until she understood what she was walking into. She had not walked into what she expected. Nobody ever did, she supposed. You aimed for one life and the train stopped somewhere else, and you picked up your bag and you figured out what the place you'd actually landed needed. What this place had needed was someone who paid attention, who saw the hairline cracks in the fruit jars, and the soft onions in the corner, and the bone under the canvas in the cold store, and the boy with the boot sole coming away, and the girl who had been carrying the whole household in her 2 15-year-old hands for 14 months without a single person telling her she didn't have to do it alone. Abigail Brennan had paid attention. That was all she'd done, really. The rest had followed from that. Outside, the creek that had gone silent in the freeze and started running again in the thaw was running still, clean and cold, and absolutely sure of its direction, the way water was always sure. Not because the path was easy, but because it understood its own nature well enough to find its way regardless. The lamp burned. The recipe book sat beside the stove. Cole turned a page of his newspaper. Joe went upstairs to bed and paused at the doorway and said, without turning around, "Good night," in the tone she used now, which was different from the tone she had used in November, less like a door closing and more like a door left slightly open. "Good night, Joe," Abigail said. The door at the top of the stairs opened and closed. Somewhere in the house, Maggie was already asleep, already dreaming whatever generous and confident dreams a 5-year-old who had known since the socks dreamed. Toby's boots were by the front door, resoled and holding. Silas's fence measurements were in a neat stack on Cole's desk, waiting for Holt to use them to give the Mercers back what was theirs. There was still so much to do. There always would be. Abigail was not a woman who needed the absence of difficulty. She had never been that woman. She was a woman who needed the difficulty to be worth it, to be in service of something real, to be shared with people who were present for it alongside her. She had that now. She blew out the lamp and went to bed in the room above the barn store with the window that showed the hills, and she did not count anything in her pockets, because there was nothing she needed to count anymore. The stars over Coldwater Creek were very clear that night, the way they got in early spring when the air had been washed cold and clean, and the hills held the ranch in their wide and indifferent arms, the same as they had held everything else that had ever tried to make a life up here. Some of it making it, some of it